really want to go through and show you the proper way to set this gun up for yourself, particularly for positional shooting. There is that general rule of thumb for length of pull, you know, from the inside of your arm to your hand, that type of stuff. But that doesn't really apply completely to what type of shooting we're doing. So we're going to go through that kind of from front to back, and then also we're going to go through how to balance your rifle properly and get the most out of it.
He should instantly have a clear view of the scope. We're going to balance this to where it balances perfectly right there and see how it's really stable. There's also an alternative grip that a lot of the top shooters use, and we're going to show that now. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is start at the very back of the rifle with the scope off. So we're going to go ahead and get Ryan to mount the rifle like he would in a positional match. And what we're going to look for is whatever bag you're using, you want to use that length from the front of the mag well to the front of the magazine to determine where this front hand placement is going to go. If you notice here, Ryan is very bladed, so he's not able to get square with the rifle. So we recommend a starting point of running this butt pad all the way in and starting there. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Now, if you have really long arms, you might find that you need to keep that butt pad ran out. And if you have very short arms, or if you're doing a lot of positional, you might find that you would prefer the short buttstock, which allows the even shorter length of pull. So if you feel like you can't square up to the rifle, then you're going to want to try to get that length of pull a little bit shorter. Okay, so now we've got the length of pull much more appropriate. You can see that his body is much more square to the rifle. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to set the scope onto the rifle, and we're going to get the cheek riser set. So go ahead and mount the rifle. And as you can see, when he first gets on the rifle, this cheek riser is going to be really tall for him because it's up really high. So if you find yourself when you first get on the rifle, we're going to have to decide whether we want to use the cheekbone or the bottom of your jawbone to use either that cheek weld or more of the chin weld, depending on what you would prefer. So Ryan prefers to use a cheek weld, and we're going to lower that down. So what we're going to do is I'm going to lower it down until he says he can see straight through the center of the scope. Got to loosen these up just a little bit. All right. And just let me know when you can see straight through the scope with no black around the edges.
Okay. No, fully black.
All right, you need to go down more?
Down more, way more.
Okay. Try that. Down more?
Yeah, just a little bit more.
All right, coming down.
Okay.
Now he's able to get a good cheek weld and eye relief. As far as the length of pull, we're going to make sure we don't set the eye relief on the scope as far as front to back until we've got the length of pull set. So if you make a length of pull adjustment, you're probably also going to want to make a scope adjustment forward and back to match that. All right, so we've got our cheek weld set, so we can go ahead and snug this up. So we've got the scope set for the length of pull. We've got our cheek height set. So now what we're going to look at is to make sure that when I cover the scope and he gets behind the rifle, go ahead and mount the rifle. And I'm going to move my hand, and he should instantly have a clear view of the scope. If he's looking through a tube, we're going to want to move that scope forward and back to figure out exactly where it's at. So if I cover that up and he feels like he needs to move his head forward, we're going to move the scope back a little bit. If I cover it up and he opens his eyes and he feels like he needs to move his face back, then we're going to move the scope the other way. That's one way of doing it. The other way is to have the more of a jaw weld, so I can show you that if you'd like. Yep. So for me personally, this is absolutely one way of doing it. There's nothing at all wrong with it, but we wanted to show both ways so that guys can know. So in order to start with that, we would lower this down a lot more. And what this is going to do is allow you to, when you get square behind the rifle and I drop down, all right, I still need a little bit lower. All right, so right here, I'm able to use the bottom of my jawbone on top of the pad right here. And what that does is it allows me to kind of float my head around just a little bit to make sure I'm looking through the scope straight. So if you see some people's adjustments that are way down like this, that's because they prefer that method. And then if you see a person's back up around 3.5 where Ryan's was, that's because they prefer more of the cheek weld method. So nothing wrong with either one. It's just a different way of doing the same thing. I think now we're going to talk about balance of the rifle and adding weights. So again, we talked about the distance from the front of the mag well to the front of the bag is very important. Okay, so if we are using, say, like this pint-sized bag, the distance from the front of the mag well to the front of the bag is going to be different than, say, like a full-size Game Changer or a pint-size, or maybe even a solo sack or whatever bag you use. So what we're looking for, what I prefer is to balance the rifle about 1 inch forward of the center of the bag. So right now, if I take the tension off of this head, you can see that the rifle wants to fall towards the rear. Okay, so it's rear heavy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where the center of the bag is, and then we're going to try to set the anvil head about 1 inch forward of the center of that. All right, so the center's right there. So we just need to move it forward just a touch.
Forward?
Yep, right there. All right, so that's about 1 inch forward of the center of the bag. And then we're gonna balance this to where it balances perfectly right there. And what that's gonna do is allow your face to touch here. It'll be a little bit front heavy, but that allows your face to touch here so that it's not perfectly neutral. And that's just how I prefer it. There's no, you know, exact hard rule on that, but to me, that's where I prefer it. So it used to be at the front of the mag well, and we found that by putting it to the center of the bag actually gets you a lot better there. So we're gonna add some weights now.
We already do have all the internal weights in this right now. So, because we wanted to add the weight into it, just so we had it in there, and now we're gonna actually do the final balancing with the externals.
Depending on how many weights you have, the further out you start is gonna have the most effect. Just like a scale that you stand on, the old balance beam style scales. So I'm gonna, for the purposes of the video, I'm gonna start at the end, and that's gonna give us the most leverage on the gun here. All right, so we're gonna check this and see if it balances now. So I can feel that it's less rear heavy, but we're still not quite there yet. All right, so now that we have 3 sets of weights, we're able to completely loosen this, and it'll pretty much just sit here. Again, if you need to take a little bit more weight out of the front, a little bit more weight out of the back, you can use that aluminum bag rider, and that'll allow you to balance this a little bit better. Now, if you're not wanting to have your rifle, if you want to reduce the weight of the total weight of the rifle, but you still want to balance it, you can opt to not put all the weights in the very back here on the internals, and when you add the weights on the externals, it allows you to have the same amount of weight but still get that balance. Now, why do we need the balance? What the balance does for us, if we're resting this rifle on a prop in a PRS or NRL type match, what that does is allow us to get a lot more stable, and we're able to control the recoil better, because if the rifle is real rear heavy, under recoil it's going to want to fall backwards, and just being able to get stable when this is properly balanced, it will sit really nice on a bag. So as you can see, I'm going to pop this off, and I'm going to set that bag on here. So now when I set that on there like that, this rifle will sit here, and like I can push a little bit here, I can push a little bit here, and see how it's really stable. So we're not going to free recoil, but by having that balanced rifle, it's going to allow us to get really nice and stable and use the proper techniques when we're behind the rifle. All right, it's also important to remember that things like a sky pod will add weight to the front of the rifle. So if you balance your rifle with that sky pod, then you need to remember that that's important as far as the balance point. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is how to adjust the grip position. So what we're going to do is he's going to mount the rifle, and however he would normally, his hand naturally lands when he's behind the rifle. We're going to look at that. Now, go ahead and place your finger on the trigger. The weapon's clear. So if he has a good 90-degree trigger press and he doesn't have tension in his wrist, then the grip is in the proper place. But let's say that his hand is too far forward or too far backwards, what we'll see is he won't be able to achieve a good 90-degree trigger press. So if his finger is like that, so it's too far forward and he's trying to reach back for the trigger, or if his grip is too far back and he's trying to reach forward for the trigger, then we will adjust that grip forward and back. Now, there's also an alternative grip that a lot of the top shooters use, and we're going to show that now. So that's where the fingertips are touching the front. And you can see here, if he had this rifle adjusted like that, he would need to move the grip back in order to get that flat 90-degree trigger press on the trigger there. So that's adjusting the grip. So just have that grip adjusted forward and back based on how you can get a good 90-degree trigger finger.